Before I put up my presentation, I'm just going to show everybody how to peel post-it notes. Now, I'm sure a lot of you on the call know how to peel post-it notes, but a lot of people don't. So here we go. Here's a deck of post-it notes, and here's the most obvious way to peel post-it notes, which is wrong, like this. And look at that. It's a beautiful curl, which is really hard to photograph later on, and it falls off the wall. Okay. Now, there's many good ways to peel post-it notes. Here's one good way, because we are going to be using post-it notes physically if you've got them, or you can use virtual post-it notes for the workshop. All right, so put your thumb under, and with the deck, slowly lever it up so it sort of pops off like that. Now, it's a little bit curled, but it's nowhere near as bad as it was. Sometimes you can get them perfectly flat, but that's how to peel post-it notes. Pop them off, keep them nice and flat. Not the obvious way. All right, I'm just going to share my screen now. Right, so we're here to talk about personal Kanban. Now I call it Kanban, other people call it Kanban. I'm probably pronouncing it incorrectly, but I do apologize if that's the case. All right, so the first thing I'll go through is the definition of Kanban, where the word comes from. There we go, Kanban definition. And I've got a little set of cards here to remind me for stuff that isn't on the slides. All right, so it comes from a Japanese word and it means card, and it's used as an indicator. It's also used as a slang term for billboard, so it's sort of an indicator, card, sign. And a good way to think about how it's being used in manufacturing is, imagine I'm on a production line and I'm assembling a part onto a machine. So I'm standing at my station and the machines are going past, and I've got a little trolley and I pick up a part and I put it onto the machine. And I pick up another one, and there might be 10 things in the trolley. And what they'll do is they'll put literally a piece of card between, say, number 7 and number 8. So when I pick up number 7 item and start putting it onto my machine, the person who brings me in the new trolleys knows it's time to go get the next trolley of 10 things. So by the time I've picked up the other 2, it's now got a replenished trolley. So that's kind of the way that Kanban's been used in a manufacturing capacity to indicate useful information. And then I started looking around and I saw this everywhere. So, you know, pre-COVID, when we used to go to a restaurant and we sit down, you know, they bring you the menu. So everyone who's serving in the restaurant knows if you're sitting at a table with a menu, then you haven't ordered yet. Because when you do your order, they take the menu away. And so then everyone knows if I'm sitting at a table with no food in front of me and no menu, I'm waiting for food. So there's indicators everywhere, visual indicators, and they help processes to flow better. All right, so now let's get into personal Kanban. So let me just actually click on the screen. There we go. In personal Kanban, there are only 2 rules, and they are to visualize your work and to limit your work in progress. That's it. There are no other rules. You can visualize your work however you like, and you do need to limit your work in progress. Now, the people that came up with this idea were Jim Benson, Antonia, and Di Maria Barry. So after this session, if you want to go and learn more information, feel free to search on personal Kanban. They've written a book as well. There's quite a lot of science behind this approach as well. But we're just going to go through why I use it and how I use it and what I learned from it in this session. Okay, so here's a really boring example. You can visualize your work however you like, however it makes sense to you. This is the boring one with 3 columns: ready, doing, done. You could also call it to do, in progress, done. So whatever you call it, doesn't matter either. But you'll notice in the middle column, the doing column, we've got an extra section and it's called the pen. And that stands for pending or holding pen. So that's where you put stuff when you're waiting for a response or you're waiting for something to happen. So say I make a call and I'm waiting for someone to call me back, then what I'll do is I'll put the ticket into the pen, and that means I can keep going with other stuff and I won't lose track that I'm waiting for someone to call me back. Now, you may or may not have noticed the little number in the top of the doing column. That is your work in progress limit, or WIP limit for short. And what that means in this case with the number 3 is I can only have 3 things going on at any one point in time. All right, so that's why the pen's really handy, because it lets me get on with stuff without losing track that it's in progress, but not actually working on it. So why do we have work in progress limits? Well, it is tempting to start many things at once because our brains logically say if we start a lot of things and keep working on a lot of things, we'll finish a lot of things. But that's actually incorrect. So what happens when we have a lot of things on the go at once is it increases our cognitive load, which means we've got less time to process stuff. So here's an example. I'm thinking about flowers, a present, adding numbers up, Excel spreadsheets. It's a lot of things to be going on in my head. And we pay a price for that because it takes our attention away from what we're trying to achieve. There's a risk that we'll leave things unfinished. This is my attempt to draw a Tyrannosaurus Rex. And if I was building a fence for a T-Rex and I had too many other things on the go, there's a bit of a risk that I might leave that unfinished, and you don't want to do that if you've got a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Now this one's super important and really hard. I found it really hard to get my head around at first. It's called context switching. So when we're switching between tasks, or when we start any task, it actually takes a little while to ramp up into effectiveness and become quite fluid at doing it. Then when we change to another task, we've got to ramp up again. And then when we change back, we've got to ramp up again. So an example is, imagine I've got a bunch of receipts or something and I'm entering numbers into a spreadsheet. Okay, so I'll get into flow fairly quickly. Okay, here's a number, type it in, here's a number, type it in, etc., etc. But if someone calls me, I'll take the call. It can be a 30-second call, it can be a 30-minute call, it doesn't matter. I've been interrupted. And when I go back to it, it'll take me a little while before I go, where was I again? Oh yeah, okay, here. Then start looking up the numbers and start typing them in. So I've actually lost productivity for a period of time. Now that's an example of quite a small and simple activity. There are really complicated activities. If any of you have ever done software coding or interrupted someone who's writing software, they get quite annoyed. And the reason they get annoyed is it's a very complicated activity. They've got lots of moving parts and they've got lots of things going on in their brains. And as soon as you interrupt them, it's going to take them up to 20 minutes to get back to where they were as far as being effective. So once you start swapping between more than 5 or so things at a time, you can lose half of your productivity. That's right, 50% of your productivity can be gone. Shocking. And there's a risk of forgetting things like, visual joke, kettle on the stove. All right, so here are the benefits of putting work in progress limits in place. You end up with an increased sense of achievement. I actually like to have physical post-it notes. I'll use virtual when I need to, but I really get a nice little dopamine hit, a reward, when I put that sticky note into the done column. So I feel that I've achieved stuff when I start seeing stuff flowing into the done column. It's pretty good. As I said before, with the context switching, if you can actually focus on doing less things and you can focus on getting them done, you actually get increased capacity so you can get more done in your day. Horrifying and shocking. Okay, and you get better at prioritization. If you've only got a small limit of work in progress items, you get pretty selective and you get better at selecting what should go into that mixture of work. Now, most humans can handle between 3 and 5 items of work in progress at any one point in time. So if you're just starting with a WIP limit for personal Kanban, pick a number between 3 and 5 and see how you go. All right. Now, where do you set up your board? There's lots of really good options. So one option, I love an excuse to go to Officeworks or somewhere like that. I'll go buy a little physical whiteboard and I'll go and buy a nice set of, coloured post-it notes and I'll set it up. So physical board is a nice option. Another option is your sticky notes application on laptops or other computers. What I find there, because you don't have the lines, I colour code them so I know what status they're in. I was always worried about accidentally dragging stuff into the wrong spot. Or if you like to carry a notebook around with you or a folder, you can put a nice little personal Kanban on the inside cover. So there's lots of options that way. There's also applications, so online applications. And I'll just tell you a quick little story. I've got a friend, his name's Chris. And so I drew these pictures. So what he did, he and his brother their mum was unwell at one point in time. And so they had to do activities to look after her and help around the house. But of course, they're all adults, so they live in different places. So they used the application Trello. and they set up a Trello board of all the things that needed to be done, and they're able to keep track of what still needed to be done and who was doing it and whether it was completed or not. So it's pretty useful that way. All right, now what do you do with the sticky notes, etc.? Well, one item per post-it note, not literally the words one item, but one activity per post-it note, because that way you can reprioritize, you can easily move them around. And whatever design you have, don't forget to have a pen area or a pending area for stuff that's waiting and on hold. So I was a bit skeptical about personal Kanban when I first heard about it. I was off to a conference and I heard about this personal Kanban workshop that was being held afterwards. And I thought, well, what's the point of that? I was already doing Kanban at work. It's just personal Kanban is just for me. And so I actually ended up at that workshop and I spent a whole day with Jim Benson learning about personal Kanban, and I was still skeptical. I wasn't sure how much use it would be to me. Then eventually I tried it and I started it with stuff around the home. So this is what I call the tree story, picture of a tree, because I had a whole bunch of activities and they were ticking along quite nicely and it was working very well. But I noticed this thing in the to-do column wasn't getting done. And that was prune the backyard, prune the trees in the backyard. Now we've got a house that's standard for the 1950s, so it's got quite a large yard. And I looked at that note and I thought, why aren't I starting that piece of work? Am I lazy? Well, probably yes. But there was something else going on. And what that was if I brought that into the doing column, then I'd never finish, because our green waste bin is only the normal size of a green waste bin. It gets emptied every fortnight. It's quick to fill up. So this would stay in doing forever, right? Because I can only empty the green waste bin every fortnight. So I screwed that post-it note up and I wrote a new one and it said, fill the green waste bin. And that's when I had my real aha moment, because there's two things that personal Kanban helps with. One is organizing your day-to-day activities, which it's really good at. The other thing is noticing things about how I think about the work, how I feel about the work, and how I can improve what I do. So I realized I don't just do this at home. Sometimes I think about a task, oh, that's such a big task. How am I ever going to start? That's what I was doing with the trees. But I've reflected on my career and there have been times when I put off big stuff. So now if I find myself even starting to think that's a big thing, I'll remember the tree story and I'll start to think about, well, how can I grab a piece of work, just like fill the green waste bin, so that I can get started rather than thinking about it as a gigantic activity. So that's why I really like personal Kanban now, but I was skeptical until I tried it and then had this insight that I can actually learn things about myself. It's really cool. So what I'd like you to do, if you've got access to a sticky notes application, there's, if you're using Microsoft Teams, for example, there's a planner function that's quite good. If you've got some small post-it notes and an A4 sheet of paper or something, if you can take about 5 minutes or so and think about somewhere between 7 and 12 items of work activities that you've either just finished or in progress or are ready to start, and have a go at setting up your own personal Kanban. Because what I find is by having a go at doing it like this, it actually elicits some pretty useful questions. So before you go into that, you're going to get about 5 minutes. Does anyone have any questions about the activity or what we've done so far? And I won't be able to see the questions, will I? Let me just check.
No, I don't think there seems to be any coming through, Kim.
Brilliant. All right, so if people can take about 5 minutes and then we'll open up for questions. If while you're doing it, you think of any questions, just pop them in there and we'll see how we go. That's a good question. What's ready again? Ready is to do, so stuff that hasn't yet started. So it's anything, any activity that you haven't yet started. Okay, question from Greg. What was the feature in Microsoft Teams that you mentioned? It's called Planner. It is really just a nice little virtual version of a Kanban board. So you create little tickets and then you can have different headings. You can have as many columns as you like. So you can set it up as 3 columns or whatever. Cool. If your task is fill the green bin, is it really ever done? The bin will get emptied and you need. Yes. So you can have recurring activities. If you think around the household, you know, clean the bathroom, you know, tidy up this and do the washing. Those are repeating tasks, but the activity itself gets finished. So I fill the green waste bin. So while I'm filling it, it's in progress. Then when I've filled it, it's done. And then when it gets emptied, I can put it back into the ready column so that I'm ready to start it again. So yes, yeah, yes, pruning the backyard never gets done. We do have a mulcher now, so that helps as well. All right, so as you finish creating your own personal Kanban, are there other questions that people have? And while I'm waiting for questions, I'll tell another story. So this is the knitting story. So it's a picture of knitting. I'm a serial crafter. So I love to knit and crochet. And at one stage, I had a lot of half-finished projects. So the good news is wool is a great insulator. So you can never have too much wool in the house. It's great for noise insulation and temperature insulation. But after the tree story, I thought, oh, this personal Kanban has got something to it. And I would like to finish all of those things. So what I did is I wrote one little ticket for each item. And I started focusing on getting them done one at a time, which was really good. So I got a whole bunch of things finished that had been in progress for far too long. Then I came to one article, which was a vest. So a 3-part vest, button up, you do the back and then you do 2 fronts. But it was cable knitting, which I'm not very good at. So it took me a while. But I did one extra thing, and it's not a rule of personal Kanban, but it actually turned out really useful. What I did when I started the back was I wrote the date I started it in the bottom left corner. And then when I finished it, I wrote the date that I finished it. And I got a big surprise because when I looked at that ticket with the dates, I said to myself, that took me about 6 weeks. No, it took me about 12 weeks. And I was shocked, literally shocked. I'm like, that can't be right. It felt like about 6 weeks I was doing that piece. What's going on? So what was going on is I was lying to myself about how much effort I was putting into the knitting. And for anyone who does knitting or crochet garments, anytime you make it, they always say in the instructions, make sure that you press the pieces before you sew the seams because you'll get a neater finish. And to be honest, I'd never really worried about it before then because I thought, well, I didn't spend that long on it. It's not that rolled up, be all right. But now I understand that whatever time I thought I spent on it, I've probably spent about twice as long and twice as much effort. So now I do press the pieces before I sew them together. So that was a really interesting insight. So by capturing little bits of extra information on the tickets, you can learn something useful about how you feel about the work and what you're doing with the work. And you can use that to improve your approach. There we go. Tips on the language we use in the sticky note. Goal, language, task, language. So, so language and also the level of detail. So generally at this point, I get quite a few questions about level of granularity. Language is another good and related point. So from a language perspective, I like to put it in the way that I understand it. But as per the tree story, that gives me my own insight. So how do I understand the activity before I notice the tree story insight was I always used to think about it as, oh, got to prune the whole backyard, right? So that's what I wrote, prune the backyard. And then as soon as I learned to reframe it, it turned into fill the green waste bin. So you could make it a goal, but then that comes to the level of granularity, right? The way to explain what level of detail to do, you can go far too small and you can go far too big. So let's go to an extremely small, stupid example. Imagine that I got to the point that I wanted to note everything I had to do. I would get to the point where I'm even starting to write post-it notes about having to write a post-it note. So that's too much detail. If I'm spending so much time curating my post-it notes, then it's too much detail. Then the opposite end of the spectrum is something like a goal, right? So if I wrote something like gain wisdom, I might never have that done. I might, think I've gotten to a point of gaining wisdom, but then I'd realize, because I think that's how wisdom works, I'd realize I'm not as wise as I thought. So I think goals, tasks, activities are fine. My guidance is put it how you think of it first, and then notice what you do with it. And that will teach you what's the right kind of language to use for your own, because it's personal Kanban. It's for you to manage your work and your activities, and for you to get insights about how you feel about the work and how you think about the work. So hopefully that's answered that question. How long should you spend on the board? When do you suggest is the best time, morning or night? That's a really good question as well. So I've waxed and waned with personal Kanban. So sometimes I'll be very diligent about it and I'll try and capture everything that I've got going on in my head. And other times I won't use it for months at a time. So there was a time, and what's the best time, morning or night? It's really up to you. Some people like to keep on top of things, especially over a busy weekend, in the moment. So they'll keep going back to the board as they're doing stuff, and they might even keep reprioritizing what's in the ready or the to-do column during that time as well. So the other thing is you don't use it to plan like a day. You use it to capture what's going on in your head. So there's an example where last year, middle of the year, I was going to be away from home for 9 days. And it was a combination of work-related consulting. It was a combination of attending some training and a bunch of other things. And I literally had half a day in the Elaborate office to get ready for it. And I walked in the morning and I'm like, oh, don't forget this, don't forget that, don't forget this other thing. And I opened up my laptop and I opened up the sticky notes application. And before I forgot everything, I wrote one post-it note per thing that I was worried about. And what was great is that helped me get through it in the morning. So by the time I walked out at lunchtime, I know that I'd tackled everything that I needed to tackle. So hopefully that answers that question. Cool. There's another story to tell you as well. This is a story that Jim Benson told me. So there's the picture for it to remind me. And what he said is he really doesn't like bookkeeping activities, and he's got his own small consulting business, right? But you've got to do it. You've got to do the bookkeeping. And because he didn't like it, he would write those activities and tasks on bright orange post-it notes and put them in the to-do or ready column and let them build up until he just had to get it done. And he said one day he was sitting down because he finally had to do a bunch, and he started to do them one at a time. And instead of putting them in the done column, he gleefully scrunched it up and chucked it on the floor. After a while, he turned around and he looked at the floor and he said, he's looking at this great big pile of scrunched up bright orange post-it notes. And he goes, time I hired a bookkeeper. All right. So again, there are no rules other than visualize your work and limit your work in progress. So how you feel when you put something into the done column, or even if you avoid putting it in the done column because you gleefully are happy to chuck it away, that tells you something about how you feel about the work. So I thought that was a really good story as well. Right, what other questions do people have? So while we're waiting, there is one more slide I have, which is this. So limiting work in progress. So when I first started using Kanban years ago, I wasn't really taught about limiting work in progress because we started from a Scrum side of things rather than a Kanban side of things. So limiting work in progress is not something that Scrum tends to factor in right at the start. So you may or may not have tried it at the team level. And there are a couple of ways to limit work in progress. And the first one that I've put here is to use avatars or pictures, so to indicate, and you have a limited number. So for example, here, person A has 2 avatars and person B has 2 avatars, and you can only stick them on 2 post-it notes each. So that means there might be 6 things in progress, but there's only 4 that are actually being worked on at the moment. The other 2 aren't being worked on. So that's a good way to limit work in progress. It doesn't tell you a lot of useful information though. So the other way to do it, I'm just going to get rid of this. The other way to do it is on the right. So what you do is you have the WIP limits at the column level. Now, when you've got team activities, things normally go through stages. So stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and in stage 1, I've got 2 work in progress limit. Stage 2, I've got number 1, and stage 3, I've got 3. So what that means is, even if I finish the one in the middle, I cannot put it into the 3rd column until one of those gets done. Now this is very useful because what it shows me is where are the bottlenecks in the work and where are the opportunities for improvement. And it also gives me a lot of really nice metrics I can later on use to tell when I'm making improvements or when I'm making it worse. So work in progress limits are really useful for personal Kanban, and they're really useful at the team level. All right, there's another question. How do you recommend managing the backlog of personal tasks that would feed into your personal Kanban, especially if it's an extensive list? Yes. Okay, so I'm going to tell a story about a work Kanban. So this wasn't personal Kanban, but I had a friend who was a business analyst, and he was on a project. And what he had to do was he had to write 600 user stories and put them into a system. I think it was Jira. Then that project decided to go on a design thinking activity to go and find out what do customers or potential customers actually want. And that lasted 12 weeks. And then when they came back, all those 600 stories he'd written were not required anymore. So that's another place to learn. It is good to get things out of your head and onto a post-it note because you do start to reduce your worry about it. I actually delivered this session at a client a few weeks ago. And then when I caught up with one of the people who'd organized it, she'd started to use personal Kanban, and she told me that as soon as she started using it, she's sleeping better at night, which is awesome. So she's not worrying about stuff. Cool. So if you've got an extensive list of backlog items or backlog to do or ready items, that tells you something as well. All right. So you can even just go through that before you've started working on it and see what is it that I'm writing down? What is the nature of these things that I'm writing down? Why am I writing them down? And by writing them down, is it helping me? And then you might want to put in strategies to manage that. If you've got quite a lot, you might have 2 front columns, which is one is ready to start and the other is on the backlog so I don't forget about it. So there are a couple of options there. Hopefully that's answered the question. And then Carolyn's asked, what do you do with the waiting and pending column? That's really interesting. So I think there's a lot of things we can learn from that as well. How many things are going into pending? How long are they staying there? If we fill up the pending column, that tells me something about the fact that the nature of my work is reliant on a lot of inputs from other people or a lot of things to bake, because it's like a cake, right? I put the cake in the oven, the ticket would then go down into pending while it cooks, because, you know, cakes don't cook in an instant. And then after that, I can go back and continue with the cake. So what to do with the waiting and pending column is to notice what's going on there and just use it to keep track of things. Use it to, I think how much ends up there is pretty insightful. Again, at another client, I delivered a series of these in a row, which is one of the reasons I have these cards. These little stories I tell aren't on the slides. And if I don't have these cards, I'm at risk when I go into a second session of saying, oh, I should tell the tree story now. Did I just tell it in this session or the one before? So I use the cards to keep track of whether I've told the story or not. So I don't tell it more than once in a session. Yeah, so what do we do with the waiting pending column? We notice what's going on, and then that's what happened. So in the session, I had 4 sessions in a day, and there must have been some team members in the morning session, because in the afternoon, the manager, when we got to the activity, told me that all of her team members' pending items ended up in her to-do column, which was kind of funny. So yeah, that tells you something about the nature of work in that area as well. All right, do we have any other questions? Because I think we must be getting somewhere close to time.
Hi, Kim.
Hi, Adina.
Me again, how are you? So I just had some questions. I know that you're saying that to try and cut tasks as small as possible. How small do you actually go? So would you, for example, say, wash the dishes, or how, yeah, how do you decide how big of a task you put on?
It depends on the people that you're using it with. So for example, wash the dishes. If you're using personal Kanban for organising activities around the home, it's really useful if you've got children who are so inclined. My child ended up not taking to personal Kanban, but that's okay. Some do. It can be a real lifesaver in that case of keeping track of activities and who's doing what. When it comes to how small, you might vary that over time as well. So you know how I said before, it's silly to be writing post-it notes to the point that you're writing a post-it note about having to write a post-it note. If you're starting to write them so frequently that it's taking up more time than doing the task, that's too small. But there might be a period of time where you want to capture information about something in particular, where that makes sense. So say, for example, I was, I don't know, in a call center. I used to work in a call center at one stage, so that's the only context I can think of. And I might have this view that a lot of the customers I talk to are grumpy. Okay, so what I might do for a couple of hours is actually take note of things about the customer interaction, and maybe put happy faces, smiley faces, or neutral faces when I put it into the done column, and then look back at it. And I might find that, oh, okay, over 2 hours, there's one grumpy customer, but that makes me think everyone's grumpy, or vice versa. So then I get a bit of reality check. So they're the sorts of times when I would do very detailed capture of small activities. But most of the time, if it's something that you need to get out of your head, right? So you're going to worry about it if you don't put it on a post-it note. That's one guidance. The other one is whatever makes sense to you as an activity, and not so big that it never moves.
There's a question here from Eric Del Rio about what we do if the item in pending is back to in progress, when the limit of an in progress has been reached.
Okay. That's a really good question. So the other thing is, like, anyone who's used a Kanban board, the rule is it has to go one way. But personal Kanban, it doesn't matter, right? So if your work in progress limit is 3 and you've got 3 things in progress and someone calls you back, right, and you then have to action that, what you could do is you can put one of the other items in progress into pending, or you can put it back into waiting to start. Doesn't matter where you put it, so long as it makes sense to you.
Carolyn has asked, how long do you leave your things in done?
That's very good. And again, it depends on the level of detail we're capturing and what we want to learn from it. So like I said before, if I was doing a 2-hour capture, then I'd be leaving it in done for 2 hours. But generally, if you have a look at the done column on a weekly basis, that's generally enough to notice patterns and make decisions about what other information might be useful to capture. So that is it depends question. It's good to watch it every week, see what's happening in the done column and what's going into there. I'd probably want to look at it once a week, but I might even leave them there because it just depends on, I mean, the craft one took me months and months to finish. And so, you know, I wasn't actually getting one thing done in a week, but it helped me keep track of it. So yeah, the done column, that's a good question. All of those questions are good, and all those questions have many answers
Another question, which probably only has one answer, but how many boards do you tend to have going at any given time, Kim, out of interest?
That's a super good question, right? So learning the discipline of limiting your work in progress, if you're just starting to learn that, have one board for yourself, because otherwise if you have multiple boards and you say your WIP limit's 3 and you've got 3 boards, that means on each board you should only have one thing. Okay, but again, it does depend. So if you're comfortable with limiting your work in progress, then sometimes it makes sense to split them out. So it might make sense to have home duties one. It might make sense to have one for planning, say renovation. Yeah, so it is okay to have multiple boards, but be aware once you do that, if you're not disciplined with your work in progress, you're going to lose some of the benefits of personal Kanban.
Great, thank you, Kim. I think that's all we have time for today, but we really appreciate all of that, and I'm looking forward to building one of these on my fridge very soon, immediately after this. So thank you very much. And we do also look forward to having you present a workshop on a completely different topic, but Kneffen, in October as part of AgileAus. So thank you, Kim.
Fabulous. Thanks, Adina, and thanks, everybody.